For joining us at this panel today. I know that we have choices in the panels we decide to attend, so I appreciate your taking the time to participate in this one. The subject of my talk today, Mandaeans, are an ethno-religious community formerly resident in the region around the head of the Persian Gulf, in what are today southern Iraq and the Iranian province of Khuzestan. As elaborated in their sacred texts, the core of their faith is a doctrine known as Nasarutha, or Nazarenism, the adherents of which are most frequently called Nazareans, Nasurai. Within this group, these texts occasionally distinguish between a clergy, Tarmirutha, and a laity, Mandaiutha. The latter word, which comes from their word for knowledge, Manda, furnishes us with a useful term for the entire complex of beliefs, culture, faith, and practices associated with this doctrine, namely Mandaeism. Thus, its followers are often called Mandaeans, although we could just as easily refer to them as Nazareans or even Gnostics, using the Greek word for knowledge, or gnosis, in place of an Aramaic one. To their non-Mandaean neighbors in the region, they are most commonly known as Asabi'una, or Sabians, employing a term lifted from the religious vocabulary of the Quran, but this last designation is conspicuous by its absence from their classical literature. That literature is recorded in a script unique to their community. Most conventional accounts of this script start by describing it as an alphabet of 24 characters, the 24 Malki, or kings, of the Mandaean cosmology. These kings are in fact the 22 familiar letters of the Aramaic script, with an additional 2 characters, a ligature of the letters D and Y, and the initial letter Halko, giving us 2 sets of 12 characters beginning and ending in a circle, a bit like Finnegan's Wake or Dahlgren. This sort of abecedary is extremely common, which makes it all the more remarkable that it is not in fact the way that Mandaeans organize their own script. Instead, they structure their letters in the form of 79 syllables, consisting of 5 vowels and 17 consonants in different permutations, with 3 of those vowels, which bear the names circle, reverse, and tooth. This results in some very interesting spelling conventions. For example, the name Ram is spelled Ra circle, M doesn't have anything, rather than Ro circle M. Mandaean spelling is thus syllabic, or more properly Moraic, as closed syllables, such as Ram, are divided into 2 morai. Another interesting feature of such names is that each bears a numerical value ranging from 1 to 12, which is somehow associated with the signs of the Zodiac that govern the hour of the bearer's birth, as outlined in the aptly named Asfar Malwashi, or Mandaean Book of the Zodiac. Note, for example, that the male name Ram and the female name Hawa both have the numerical value 1. You might very well wonder how these values were calculated, and indeed Stefana Drower herself, who first documented this feature, was long convinced that these values were completely arbitrary. So, where do these zodiacal numbers come from? Well, there are 2 answers to this question. The first concerns how people come to be assigned a specific numerical value. This has to do with the signs of the zodiac governing the month and hour of their births. In her Mandaeans of Iraq and Iran, Drower employs the metaphor of a circle to explain how priests calculate these values, something like the face of a clock. When an infant is to be named, the priest takes the sign governing the month in which the birth occurred, and adds the sign governing the hour of the child's birth, moving around a circle with 12 points. This gives us the value of the child's full name, which is to say, the combined value of its given name and its mother's name. Therefore, we must subtract the mother's name from the resulting figure in order to arrive at the value of the given name, which is then selected from a list much like the one I have just shown. This sort of calculation is described as gmaṭ aria, the binding of Leo, or of the lion, in the Mandaean Book of the Zodiac. It is evidently a meta-analysis of Greek geōmetríā, which is of course also the source of Hebrew gematria. Significantly, the base for these calculations is 12 rather than 10, which is counterintuitive for those of us schooled in the decimal system. You might very well ask, well, that's all well and good. I understand how someone born on such and such a day at such and such an hour could come to have such and such a value, but how did the names Ram and Hawa come to have the value 1 rather than 2, 3, or some other value? These calculations also reflect the duodecimal basis of Mandaean gmaṭ aria. As I mentioned earlier, the Mandaean script is traditionally organized into a syllabary, more properly an alphasyllabary of 79 signs, each of which has its own numeric value from 1 to 12, as illustrated in manuscripts of the Book of the Zodiac. Here is one such alphasyllabary which pairs each syllable with its value. From this we can easily calculate the value of each name by dividing it into morai and assigning a value to each mora. Thus Ram has the value of 9 plus 4, which does not equal 13, but rather 1. Using Drower's circle metaphor, we add 4 hours to 9 o'clock to arrive at 1 o'clock. Similarly, Hawa also has the value 1, not 13. In her case, we add 7 hours to 6 o'clock to again arrive at 1 o'clock. Alternatively, we can count by dozens, yielding 1 and 1 dozen rather than 3 and 10, and that actually gets us closer to how these numbers are calculated, even in the absence of any exponentiation of the base. Put simply, there are no place values in Mandaean arithmetic. If there were, the chart might look something like this, in which I have recorded not only the units, but also the dozens and the grosses. Thus, the sound Ra actually has the value 9, 4 dozens, and 1 gross. But returning to the metaphor of the clock again, we have passed 201 hours and repeatedly gone round and round that circle to land at 9 o'clock. If we consult the signs all the way to our right, the ones that don't have anything, we discover something interesting. Our first 10 characters from Halko to Alephimendi have the same values as those assigned to other forms of the Aramaic script, and by extension the Arabic script, in numerological systems like gematria or lettrism. The same is true for the following 12 characters, although this is not immediately obvious due to the duodecimal nature of Mandaean aria and the absence of any place value notation. Thus, 8 and a dozen, the numerical value of Alephimendi, is equivalent to 20. 6 and 2 dozens, the numerical value of Alephimendi, is equivalent to 30, and so on. In this manner, the decimal origins of the alphabetic numbers is made manifest, even if they have been pressed into service as ciphers for a duodecimal system. In the table to the right, I have illustrated both the base 10 and base 12 values of these alphabetic numbers in order to illustrate the logical progression from units to decades and centuries, rather than from units to dozens and grosses, together with their zodiacal numeration in the fourth column, these corresponding to the units of the base 12 figures. This complex hybrid of decimal and duodecimal notation, employing different permutations of the 22 letters of the Aramaic script to encode a range of numerical values, is seemingly unique to Mandaeans. We may infer that Mandaeans borrowed the decimal values of the alphabetic numerals when they adopted the Aramaic script, but they must have adapted it for their own purposes. A vestige of the same mathematical system underlying this new application of the alphabetic numerals also appears in the Mandaean Book of Kings, in which a period of 480,000 years is divided equally into 7 parts. I would like to draw your attention to 2 things here. First, the precision of the quotient, accurate to within 5 seconds, displays an extremely high degree of mathematical insight. Second, all these units of time, 12 months in a year, 30 days in a month, 12 hours of daytime and 12 hours of nighttime, 12 soshi and 60 pegi in an hour, are all reckoned according to factors of 60. The least common multiple of 10 and 12, reflecting their ultimate origins in the Babylonian sexagesimal system. While the traditional Aramaic script of 22 characters is obviously insufficient for the purpose of sexagesimal notation absent place value designations, it is nonetheless perfectly adequate for representing most of its factors, such as 10 and 12. One question remains, however: why create a number syllabary when everyone else is using an alphabetic numeral system? It is almost certainly significant that cuneiform number syllabaries, such as the one illustrated by this line drawing, served as an alternate form of notation within the same period, well into the Seleucid period. While it may seem scarcely credible that Mandaeans, for whom our earliest extant manuscripts date to the 16th century, might have adapted the Aramaic alphabetic numeral system into a number alphasyllabary on the model of these earlier cuneiform parallels, such number syllabaries offer its only true parallels, in the region or anywhere else for that matter. As unlikely as it might seem that the Mandaean number alphasyllabary reflects a genuine survival of these earlier number syllabaries, the prospect that Mandaeans either revived or independently reinvented the system in medieval times is all the more unlikely. As I've demonstrated elsewhere, the epoch of the Mandaean years of Pisces, 322 BCE, is roughly contemporaneous with the most recently attested examples of the cuneiform number syllabaries, and therefore both institutions, the calendar and the number alphasyllabary, would both represent palpable links with the 4th century before the Common Era. The connection between the two institutions is made manifest through their shared role in Mandaean gmaṭ. But really, just how plausible is it that Mandaeans might preserve one of the conventions of cuneiform numeracy into the 21st century? It must be admitted that the Book of the Zodiac and the indigenous epistemology that it represents emerged to mixed reviews. The British Arabist Arthur Stanley Tritton opined that if anyone were tempted to believe in astrology, a study of this book would cure him. And the Dean of the History of Science himself, Georges Sarton, dismissed the work as a wretched collection of omens, debased astrology, and miscellaneous nonsense, ultimately derived from Arabic, Greek, Persian, and of all the superstitious flotsam of the Near East. Even so, no less an authority than Otto Neugebauer leapt to its defense, castigating Sarton with the words, "When the recognized dean of the history of science disposes of a whole field with the words, 'the superstitious flotsam of the Near East,' he perhaps does not fully realize how much he is contributing to the destruction of the very foundations of our studies, the recovery and study of the texts as they are, regardless of our own tastes and prejudices." His review of Drower's works within the pages of the Journal of the American Oriental Society is full of bouquets, both for Drower and for the subject of her scholarship, concluding with the words, "It required unusual courage, patience, and knowledge for her to handle this material so successfully. I hope that an intensified study of this field, which teaches us so much about the civilizations of the Near East, will come as partial repayment of the debt which we owe Mrs. Drower." I would submit that this debt is still outstanding. That being said, members of our society, such as Czechi Rochberg and Joanne Scurlock, have indeed identified paraphrases, in some cases partial translations, of several Babylonian ominous series within the Book of the Zodiac, which Christomilo Kessler attributes to Mandaean contact with the living, albeit attenuated, Babylonian scribal culture during the 1st century of the Common Era and perhaps later. For her part, Rochberg sides with Müller-Kessler in proposing that these parallels arose because of the direct availability of certain cuneiform scholastic texts, whereas Scurlock seems to suggest that they were mediated by a Hellenistic filter. But of course, the two propositions are not mutually exclusive. Markham J. Geller evidently remains agnostic about all this. For him, the question hinges upon whether Mandaic texts were derived from Akkadian before the demise of cuneiform script, or were simply remembered orally and imperfectly, later committed to writing. He suggests that someone should go check the Mandaic text, but does not volunteer himself to do so. The Mandaean number alphasyllabary would therefore appear to be one more datum in favor of a scribal continuity between cuneiform and Mandaic literature. But just how old is this practice, and do we have any evidence for it outside of the Book of the Zodiac, for which it must be admitted that our earliest manuscript dates of the 19th century? Drower, among others, compares Mandaean gmaṭ to Jewish gematria, but as we've discovered, it's a different sort of animal. For starters, it is only used for divination, for determining things like the gender of an unborn child or the length and severity of an illness, and seemingly never as a hermeneutical tool, unlike gematria. There are, however, some intriguing hints to the contrary, which might help us to date the antiquity of gemaṭ. So, for example, at several points in the Mandaean liturgy and in the scriptures, the Mandaean supreme being Hei is described as Yehida or Lehdeya, unique, single individual. This is perplexing because the word Hei itself is in fact a plural word, and the same epithet, the Lehdeya Rabbazadiqa, or great righteous individual, is also applied to his son, the second life, who is by no means an individual or even the only begotten son of the first life. These passages acquire a new significance in light of the fact that the numerological value of the name Hei is in fact 1. This fact also explains another curious feature of the name Hei. As Noldeker notes, it is one of about half a dozen or so Mandaic words that are consistently spelled defectively in the classical literature, without a vowel in the first syllable. If it were spelled according to the norms of Mandaic orthography, like its homophone Hei, alive, live ones, its numerical value would in fact be 2 rather than 1, but this plain A spelling is never once encountered with reference to the Supreme Being or any of his offspring. The unexpected spelling of life, the epithet individual or single, and its numerical value of 1 all bear indirect witness to the existence of this system at the time when these texts were composed. Undoubtedly, further examples of Mandaean numerology as a hermeneutical device, a la geōmetríā, could be attested. To conclude, as I have demonstrated, Mandaeans organized their own script into a number alphasyllabary of 79 characters, which they employ for numerological purposes, or as we say in Mandaic, gmaṭ, binding of the lion, likely a meta-analysis of Aramaic geōmetríā, both ultimately from Greek geōmetríā. Outside of Mandaean praxis, our chief witness to this number alphasyllabary and its functions is the Book of the Zodiac, a book for which all of our earliest manuscripts are 19th century, but which is nonetheless an important source for the survival of Babylonian occult sciences into the Hellenistic era and beyond, as observed by numerous scholars such as Otto Neugebauer, Jesse Rochberg, and Joanne Scurlock. Similarly, the only extant parallels for the Mandaean number alphasyllabary are Cuneiform number syllabaries, the most recently attested in the Seleucid era, which provide us with a possible model for this uniquely Mandaean adaptation of the Aramaic alphabetic numeral system. Finally, the peculiarly but consistently defective spelling of the name of the Mandaean supreme being, its numerical value of 1, and his epithet, the individual, all potentially attest to the antiquity of this practice. Thank you very much.